All right. Welcome, folks. Welcome to the first session of Fliplanthropy that just rolls off the tongue. Have to say, we stole the name from a TV series, a satirical dark parody called The Curse, which is basically 10 episodes of investigation into the absurdity that follows from unchecked white privilege and misguided good doers. So we thought, okay, the appropriation of this title, I think, would be fitting for what we're setting out to do. And that is to challenge the current philanthropic ecosystem and try to dedicate each session to a subversion, a flipping, a new perspective on wealth and its movement. Since we're organizing this as Guerrilla Foundation, and what we do is organize funders to redistribute their wealth towards grassroots social movements, there is a larger narrative and politic behind this, and it comes with a value system. It comes with practices, and a lot of these are modeled by the Good Ancestor Movement, and we are delighted to have Stephanie Brobbey with us today to guide us through some of these concepts on an intellectual level, on an embodied level, and really to interrogate what these things really mean. Decolonization has been a bit of a buzzword for quite a few years, as has been indigeneity and indigenous wisdom. What does that actually mean in practice? What does that actually mean for practicing philanthropists, for redistributors, for those who use language that is led by a social justice perspective versus kind of carried on inherited norms that I think we're ready to evolve past. So without further ado, I pass the baton to Steph and take it away.
Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to Guerrilla Foundation for inviting me into this space. It's a real honor, and just want to acknowledge all of you for all the incredible work and nourishment that you've put out in the philanthropic ecosystem, pushing the limits that have been maintained for a really long time in terms of philanthropic practice. And so much of your work has really challenged norms and built communities. So just honoring that work and your leadership in this space. This webinar comes at a really interesting time. Ivan, you were just talking about decolonization and indigeneity, and I'm actually a few days away from embarking on a process of rematriation and returning to the land of my ancestors in a significant way. And I'm only now kind of processing my relationship to colonization in an embodied sense, which I'm sure will be a really generative experience and open up quite a lot more in terms of my own practice. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Stephanie. I'm in London, and I'm the daughter of Ghanaian migrants. I was born in the UK, and I practiced as a private wealth lawyer, as a solicitor in the UK, in the city of London. So right in the belly of the beast, in probably one of the world's kind of largest international finance hubs. And so I was advising wealthy individuals and their families on estate planning and tax. And what that involved predominantly was giving people advice on the succession of their assets, setting up trusts, administering those trusts, transferring assets like real estate into trusts, all designed to ensure the smooth succession of an individual or a family's wealth. And I actually really enjoyed this work for a time. I found it really intellectually stimulating. It was really, obviously, it's a very academic area looking at trusts and tax, but essentially it was, some days I felt like an undercover therapist or pastor, really providing a space for wealthy individuals to come and deposit what I now recognize as a need for healing, actually, that their relationship to wealth and relationship to themselves and the world presented. But I practiced for 10 years, and I entered the profession a year after the coalition government came into power in the UK. For those of you based in the UK, you'll remember that was the Lib Dem Conservative coalition government. So I entered this decade, which was punctuated by election cycles, which were mainly characterized by lots of kind of highly strung people in the private wealth industry talking about the fear of a Labour government and what that would mean, or what that might mean for their clients that had significant wealth, and what it, more particularly, what it might mean for their taxes. And so I became very politicized around this rhetoric and this narrative around, that positioned taxation as a sort of existential threat to the wealth of some of my clients and wealthy people in general. So at that time, when I was kind of deep in that trajectory, on a good day, I might be asked to set up a philanthropic foundation, and that was really exciting. As a young lawyer who was really interested in social change, and personally, I was involved in philanthropic communities. I was involved on kind of social sector boards, supporting not-for-profit organizations that were kind of very grassroots and looking to fundraise, and looking for access to resources, looking to me to leverage the power that I had in the spaces I had to support them. And so I really I was really lost in the source. I was lost in that economic paradigm, which kind of says that philanthropy and impact investing are the things that are going to get us towards this regenerative future. That all we need is more philanthropy. All we need is more people to make money and redistribute wealth through philanthropy. And so I felt really excited about that. And I guess now, looking back, speaking from my own experience and my own situation here in the UK, I'm talking specifically about the regulatory and the legal context that we have here, I discovered that charity and philanthropy is often where social justice goes to die. And often that death is a slow and painful death. And in the UK context, the legal framework is such that attempts to really drive systemic change and achieve justice, and really to lead with justice, are throttled by the rules, the regulatory frameworks, the whole system of charity, and the practice, the philanthropic practice, which then emerges around that framework. So that was quite a rude awakening that I had. And I think it's really important for me to explain that context. And, as the story goes, I became pretty radicalized and became more and more politicized around what I was doing, started putting two and two together around the fact that, the not-for-profits I was trying to help through my ethical side hustles were not going to be any better off if I continued to do the work that I did as a private wealth lawyer, enriching, the 0.1% at the expense of governments around the world because of deprivation of tax revenues through tax avoidance, and doing, all sorts of things that contributed to the concentration of wealth and power. And so I had this embodied kind of like decade-long education in capital in the 21st century, and it really radicalized me incrementally. And so I blew up my legal career. I mean, obviously, this is the abridged version. I blew up my legal career. I turned down the opportunity to make partner. Those of you who have watched Suits or know fellow lawyers, you know, partner is the top of the food chain in the legal world. And I started the Good Ancestor Movement with some amazing colleagues, because I became convinced that helping people to minimize and avoid, let's just say it how it is, avoid tax and accumulate more wealth, was not going to get us to this just economy, or, you know, a fairer future for everyone. And when I look back, I think about the scripts that I had to flip in my mind and in my worldview, and the innermost agreements that I had made with myself. That actually, when you think about it and you listen to the still, small, quiet voice in your mind, and you tune into your mind's eye, actually, most of us are making these agreements with ourselves about how the economy is, how it came to be, what is within the realms of possibility in terms of an economic system, and the way that we choose to participate in the economy and design our economy. And I started to reflect more deeply on my role as an actor in the global economy. I developed this consciousness that, you know, contrary to my day-to-day experience in the city, in this like gilded cage, you know, my world didn't exist in a vacuum. Wealth does not exist in a vacuum. And it sits within a broader economic paradigm, and philanthropy sits within that paradigm as well. And I think, you know, one of the problems with contemporary philanthropic practice is that it's so detached from a broader economic analysis. It's not situated effectively, and it is quite detached from the reality of our economy. And I often come back to the words of Professor Kehinde Andrews, who is the UK's first professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University, where he led the establishment of the first Black Studies programme in Europe. Incidentally, that Black Studies programme has recently been scrapped at undergraduate level, which is a really worrying sign of where we are at. And we know that the telltale signs of fascist and reactionary political climates, how they manifest within intellectual and academic spaces. But that's another conversation. But I just want to really highlight that as something that's really important, and reflects an attack on the progress that we are making collectively around shifting consciousness. And in the introduction to Professor Andrews' book, The New Age of Empire, which is here, would highly recommend you get a copy. The introduction, he says, we urgently need to destroy the myth that the West was founded on the three great revolutions of science, industry, and politics. Instead, we need to trace how genocide, slavery, and colonialism are the key foundation stones upon which the West was built. The legacies of each of these remain present today, shaping both wealth and inequality in the hierarchy of white supremacy. And so I had this embodied, I began to experience this embodied understanding that I had been participating in this economic system, which was built off transatlantic slavery, colonialism. You know, those are that was the architecture that set out the blueprint for our financial architecture, for philanthropy, and philanthropic practice. And it really helps. I think that quote really helps to summarize the self-deception that we often encounter and propagate, you know, perpetuate in our work and in our practice, and we constantly need to come back to in order to continue shifting our consciousness as individuals, but also collectively as a community. So wealth is often, we know that capital is often depoliticized and talked about as as if it's in a vacuum, as if it's detached from the reality of the inequitable systems that enable capital to be accumulated under the stewardship of individuals, sometimes extremely wealthy and powerful individuals, and sometimes through philanthropic foundations. We know that the colonial legacies that underpin the Western economic system, which have enabled this level of accumulation. And so turning to what this means for me in practice, me and my colleagues, the Good Ancestor Movement, we say that we exist to accelerate the just transition to a regenerative economy by leveraging the power of private capital. And the just transition strategy framework for a just transition, if you haven't come across that, I will try and find a link later and pop it in the chat. It's a framework which underpins our work and informs our praxis, the way that we practice as informed by theory and principles that came out of originally a worker-led movement around environmental justice in the Americas, and movement generation and the Climate Justice Alliance and other a coalition of different organizations came together to build this strategy framework for a just transition, which you should check out. And it's a framework. Thank you, Ivan. It's a framework which underpins our work and our partners' work. So we were never trying to engage in philanthropic practice. In fact, we had a heavy critique. We continue to maintain a healthy critique of philanthropy and mainstream philanthropic practice. But what we really wanted to do as a Good Ancestor Movement, with my background and experience in the private wealth industry, and seeing that the systemic problem of the private wealth industry itself perpetuating really toxic and unhealthy behaviors around wealth and tax. We wanted to help people develop a justice orientation in relation to their wealth and tax practices, and to develop an embodied understanding of extreme wealth, and to be able to critique philanthropy, the institution of philanthropy in relation to themselves. And so a lot of the work that we have done to date has really been focused on supporting people around their political education, and also helping them to translate what they learn about, as we retell the story of the economy, to help them translate that into practice in relation to their wealth and tax. We realized that we had to provide a container for wealthy individuals in our community to experiment with their redistribution practices, and more specifically beginning to engage in the work of redistributing wealth and power in a different way. So another script that had to be flipped was the idea that, we're just, even as we felt it was right to move into the work of creating a redistribution vehicle and providing that container and that infrastructure for individuals to start redistributing wealth and power, the temptation is to flatten that practice and just to say that we're supporting people with redistribution, and it has become something of almost a meditation, a practice of meditation, to always come back to what lies at the heart of what we're trying to do at the Good Ancestor Movement, which is to engage in solidarity as a practice with those who are most oppressed by the unjust systems that we have in the world, particularly the economic system. And we're doing that through leveraging a tool, which is the power of private capital, to accelerate the just transition to a regenerative economy that serves people and planet. So the framework that I mentioned is really important in really anchoring our work, so that we are first and foremost in developing a justice orientation, a movement orientation. And that I would say in the last year or so, having launched in September 2021, so we're 3 years in now, but in the last year or so, it's become really clear to us that what we're doing is organizing wealth holders around the redistribution of wealth and power, which is a different orientation than simply trying to improve philanthropic practice and trying to develop new tools and new relationships and trust-based philanthropy. Actually, what does it mean to try and develop an orientation that's really rooted in justice and the social movements around us and what they need, and to organize around those needs and strategies. And I guess one example of that, just to bring that to life, is a report that we published earlier this year on resourcing the solidarity economy. This was a collaboration that we undertook with our beloved movement partners, Decolonizing Economics, and shout out to Guppy, Noni, and Zara for their brilliance and for entrusting, for inviting us to be in relationship with them and to learn what it means to try and practice solidarity with movements as we seek to mobilize resources. And that was it is still a collaboration that I suppose started about 4 years ago, really, in terms of the seeds of building that relationship. And so, yeah, it took nearly 4 years for us to kind of develop this piece of work, which now informs our resourcing strategy. We were really adamant that we wouldn't try to build a resourcing vehicle of any kind without having insights through our movement partnerships, even though it's very, I've been talking a lot recently about the culture of urgency and burnout that we live in, and particularly in the philanthropic space, and really recognizing that we need to slow down in order to be in right relationship and to move at the speed of relationship is so important. So that report that we did, I can put in the chat a bit later, now underpins our resourcing strategy. It presents a mapping and kind of study of the emergent solidarity economy landscape in the UK. And by solidarity economy, we were focusing on looking at practitioners who are working to build community wealth and community power in response to the dominant economic system. And so that's where our focus is. And following on from the report, we're piloting what's known as our catalytic collective, which is a shared resourcing pool that we're collectivizing wealth holders around, who are redistributing wealth into that pool, which is governed by an accountability circle of community organizers and movement leaders who have decision-making power over how those funds are redistributed. And it was really interesting, I think, going on this journey and, seeing what comes up, what feedback we get and what we experience from those that have access to wealth when it's time to transition from learning and theory into practice, and some of the patterns of, I suppose, privilege and leaning into fragility when it is time to really act and to move money in pursuit of the just transition. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that, not to create any shame or not to attack anyone, but so that we can start to have real conversations about the levels of resistance that we're up against as we're trying to move money. in ways that are in right relationship, and what that demands from wealth holders, what it demands from philanthropic leaders, trustees in the UK context, people that are custodians of capital. So the last thing that I wanted to offer, which, you know, I'm conscious of time, so I'll leave it here after I offered this final point, which comes out really of some work that I did on a leadership cohort with seventh generation Fund for Indigenous Peoples, who are the longest standing philanthropic formation for Indigenous peoples, run by Indigenous peoples, based in California in the USA. And a little over a year ago, I was convening with them, and it was one of those, I don't even want to call it a program. It was a learning experience where the learning wasn't linear. And this is one of the mindsets that we have to develop, I think, as philanthropic practitioners, as wealth holders, as people doing the work of organizing resources and redistributing them. I have this profound realization, which always sounds really simple or maybe simplistic when I explain it to people now, but there was definitely a moment where I realized, like, this is not just about trying to engage in good philanthropic practice. I think that plays into a lot of our insecurities about being a good person, you know, particularly in this sector where everybody's trying to do good and we're all good people and we're all trying to be good ancestor movement, good ancestors. You know, I called the organization Good Ancestor Movement, right? And I think that can play into this, this sense of insecurity. And, you know, we have to do this work as a way of, we have to practice this work as a new way of being in the world. Like, it's not just about doing the thing, it's about who we are in relation to the work, in relation to each other. And you can't fake that. And we have to do the work that enables us to steward the practices that some of us are working on, that some of us want to work towards, that are justice oriented, so that we are in the work of not just improving philanthropic practice, but actually nurturing ecologies of redistribution where wealth and power are shifted in right relationship to ourselves and to each other. I think I'll stop there and hand over to you, Ivan.
I will use my position as host to just do a couple of probes. One thing that I jotted down was you guide people through this embodied experience of extreme wealth. Could you elaborate on that, or like some outcomes of what that looks like? And maybe a word or two on the dissonance between taxation and donation and a double standard that often exists within the wealth class around this. Just those two things, and then we'll stop recording.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I didn't necessarily mean it embodied in a somatic sense, although I think I'm learning that is critical, and we're in the process of kind of looking at our curriculum and exploring pedagogy and that kind of thing to think about how we can support people, you know, carry them through a more embodied experience that is rooted in, you know, in that somatic work, but really helping them to understand, you know, the idea of extreme wealth feels so offensive to people. You know, people are so much happier to talk about extreme poverty. You know, but the minute you start talking about extreme wealth, there's a lot of, you know, defensiveness and resistance, and, you know, the amount of people who say, well, you know, oh, I'm not rich, but actually they don't realize that they own assets that are 3 times, you know, the amount that I think think it's like 4 million in the UK. If you own assets of 4 million, then you're in the 1%, and you know, people own far more than that. And so really helping people to ground them in their reality. You know, I talked about wealth often being treated as if it's in a vacuum and not, you know, being very detached from reality, from the economy. Well, you know, my experience with wealth holders is, you know, there's often, you know, that level of detachment at, you know, even as a coping strategy to make peace on a day-to-day basis with the idea of, you know, having this wealth, and, you know, the shame that comes up with that for people and the anxiety that comes up. So really just creating a space where they can come to terms with the reality of how extreme wealth is showing up in their worlds, and, you know, in some cases in their bodies, right? And then your second question or probe was about what tax versus gift. I mean, we need like a whole other session for that if we really want to jump in. But yeah, of course, philanthropic. The whole idea is that we're working towards a world where philanthropy doesn't have to exist. And I am someone who believes in the power of the state and the limitations of the state. But, you know, the governments we can create governments that are well placed to provide the resources that are needed for the essentials of life, like, you know, good housing, like great education for everyone. I mean, something that you know, I live in London. We're the greenest city, I think, in Europe. Like, I'm always so thankful for the beautiful green spaces that we have, and elder care, and you know, caring for children, and, you know, we need tax dollars for all, you know, for all these things. And there's no amount of philanthropic giving that can really provide that level of resource that's needed, and nor should there be. You know, we don't want a handful of super rich and powerful people to be providing, well, yeah, to be kind of dominating those functions. We want them to pay their fair taxes, you know, just like everybody else does. You know, ordinary people don't get to choose how much they get taxed. So, you know, in the UK, working people pay an enormous proportion of their income in taxes. You know, when you look at VAT and council tax and income tax and, you know, all these things, they're paying a lot of tax. And, you know, a lot of rich people are able to find ways to minimize their tax liabilities. You know, wearing my previous hat as a private wealth lawyer, my whole existence was, you know, to really to do that. The industry really emerged around like the preservation of wealth and assets. So philanthropy can't substitute you know, what you know, tax and the idea of tax that we have. And nor should we, you know, be relying on the benevolence. We can't rely on benevolence as an alternative on an ongoing basis. And philanthropy can, you know, in the right hands, be used to redistribute wealth in ways that are really powerful in supporting and sustaining kind of ecologies of resistance in communities.
Thank you for touching on the surfaces of all these things. I know that we could do parallel sessions, but at least it's little segues so that people can also go off and continue these conversations in their own domains or their own reflections. Thanks for the inputs. We will stop the recording and it will let us know.